The blade flashes once in the daylight, and a powerful man collapses as prayers continue around him. In October 1092, on the road near Nahavand in western Persia, the Seljuk Vizier Nizam al-Mulk rode with the court of Sultan Malik Shah. Dust clung to cloaks and horse tack. Guards watched the roadside. Petitioners pressed forward whenever the procession slowed. In many later tellings, a lone man in a dervish's rough clothes stepped out of the crowd, close enough to touch the vizier's saddle, and drove a dagger into his body before anyone understood what had happened. The attacker was cut down, but the damage was already done. The empire's chief architect was dying. That quiet efficiency is the first hallmark of the group Europe would later call the Assassins. The Arabic and Persian labels, often written as Hashashin in hostile texts, are tangled and contested. Some writers used the term as an insult. Others turned it into a literal story of hashish and enchanted gardens. We will treat those drug tales as claims, not proven fact, and keep returning to what can be pinned to dates, places, and outcomes. So here is the conflict that drives our series, from about 1090 to 1273. How did a small mountain-based Nizari Ismaili community turn targeted killing into a political weapon across Persia, Iraq, and Syria? And how did later authors transform that strategy into the legend of drugged assassins who obeyed without question? To find answers, we climb into the Alborz Mountains above Kazvin, to a ridgeline fortress called Alamut, the Eagle's Nest. In 1090, a missionary and strategist named Hassan Sabah took it not by storming the walls, but by infiltration and persuasion, then held it against far stronger enemies. From that stone perch, he began building a state that rarely fought pitched battles. Instead, it traded in intelligence, alliances, warnings, and, when it chose, public killing. Our sources are uneven and often hostile. Sunni historians like Ibn al-Athir note attacks with alarm. The later Mongol-era writer Adam al-Javani describes Alamut with contempt after its fall, and travelers such as Marco Polo spread vivid stories that may reflect rumor more than observation. Modern historians, including Farhad Daftari, urge caution. The myth grew louder as the Nizari archives were destroyed. If you enjoy careful history told as a story, consider subscribing. This series is a slow walk through one of the medieval world's most misunderstood power struggles. Next, we map the Seljuk world that made a mountain fortress and a single dagger so consequential. Before Alamut became a name whispered in palaces, the Middle East already lived with fear of armies, tax demands, and sudden purges at court. In the late 11th century, the Seljuk Turks dominated a vast Sunni realm stretching from Khorasan to Iraq and into Anatolia. Their sultans ruled through military power and through the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, whose blessing mattered even when his troops were few. Roads tied cities like Ray, Isfahan, Nishapur, and Baghdad together, but those roads also carried rival claimants, rebellious emirs, and religious tension. The older Shia, Sunni divide sharpened as Seljuk officials backed Sunni institutions and punished groups they saw as threats. At the same time, the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo claimed a different kind of authority, an Ismaili Shari'i Imam Caliph, with missionaries who traveled quietly from market to market. In 1094, the Fatimid succession split. One line supported Nizar, the other supported al-Mustali. The Nizari side lost the fight in Egypt, but its followers did not vanish. They scattered and reorganized in Persia and later Syria. That political fracture, more than any intoxicant, helps explain the Nizari's hard turn toward survival tactics. The Seljuks were not a single machine. After Malik Shah, succession struggles and regional warlords pulled the empire apart. Local governors raised private forces. Fortresses changed hands. Villages were squeezed between competing collectors of tribute. For a minority community, open battle was usually suicide. The problem was simple. How do you resist when you cannot meet an army in the field? Hassan Sabah's answer was to build a defensive network in the mountains and to make enemies pay a price for persecution, sometimes with a warning, sometimes with a death. The tactic worked because the medieval political world depended on individuals, viziers who signed orders, commanders who led sieges, judges who issued condemnations. Remove the person, and policy could wobble. We glimpsed this world in Abbasid and Seljuk chronicles, in Ismaili missionary traditions preserved later, and in the way coins and inscriptions mark shifting rulers in Persian towns. Writers like Ibn al-Athir describe the era's instability as constant. Modern scholars emphasize how fragmentation made small actors suddenly dangerous. Now that the ground is set, fractured power, religious rivalry, and collapsing certainty, we can meet the man who chose the mountains and changed the rules. Part 3 begins with Hassan I Sabah on the move, learning how to preach, to hide, and to wait for the perfect stone fortress. A young man leaves the comfort of Persian cities and chooses a life of argument, travel, and danger, because he believes the world is ruled by a hidden truth. Hassan I Sabah was born in the mid-11th century, likely in Qom or Ray. In northern Persia, sources disagree on details, but they agree he was educated and intense. Ray sat on busy routes where scholars, merchants, and soldiers mixed, and where religious debates were not abstract. They shaped who held office, who was protected, and who could be punished. Hassan studied theology and the sciences of his day, then drifted toward Ismaili teaching, a form of Shari'i thought that emphasized the guidance of an imam. At some point, Hassan traveled west. Traditions place him in Egypt under the Fatimids, perhaps in Cairo, where the Caliph Imam's authority was displayed in ceremony and learning. Whether or not he met the highest officials, he certainly learned how Ismaili missionary work functioned. Small circles, careful oaths, graded instruction, and an ability to speak differently to a merchant than to a soldier. When the Fatimid succession crisis erupted in 1094, Hassan sided with Nizar, the losing claimant. That choice would shape everything that followed. So he returned east and began recruiting in Persia. He moved through towns and villages under Seljuk scrutiny, using secrecy as a shield. The Seljuks had strong reasons to fear him. They had built Sunni colleges, appointed judges, and punished heterodox groups. They saw Ismaili networks as political subversion, not mere belief. Hassan's response was not to seek a battlefield victory, but to seek ground that cavalry could not easily crush. He found it in the Alborz. Even the geography enforced secrecy. Fog rolls in fast, and a shout can die between ridges before it reaches the next valley. North of Kazvin, narrow valleys and cliff roads lead to isolated castles perched on rock. Alamut was the prize. High walls, a commanding view, and access to mountain farms and water. Hassan did not arrive with an army. He arrived with patience, placing supporters nearby, winning converts inside, and waiting for the moment when a change of loyalty could open a gate. We hear echoes of Hassan in later Ismaili tradition, while hostile chroniclers like Javani portray him as a schemer. Seljuk-era histories preserve the fear his name inspired. Modern historians compare these layers and treat the early years with cautious wording. In the next part, we step into 1090 and watch how Alamut is taken, quietly, decisively, and almost without a fight. One winter night in 1090, a fortress changes hands, and the mountains do not even echo with the sound of a siege. Alamut rises above the valleys of the Alborz like a ship of stone. The approach is narrow, the drops are steep, and the air turns thin and sharp as you climb. In Seljuk times, the fortress was held by a local commander, and like many remote outposts, it relied on a small garrison, nearby farmers, and the assumption that no one would attempt something impossible. Hassan I Sabah attempted it anyway. Accounts suggest he did not storm the walls. He placed trusted men in the region, gained supporters inside, and waited until the garrison's loyalties softened. Then, at the decisive moment, Hassan entered and asserted control. Some versions describe a payment offered to the previous holder. Others emphasize persuasion and surprise. Whatever the exact mechanism, the outcome is clear. By 1090, Hassan held Alamut and began fortifying it for a long war of endurance. Holding it was the real test. Seljuk forces could send cavalry through valleys, but bringing a large army onto the ridge roads was slow and dangerous. Supplies mattered more than heroics. Hassan organized terraces, water storage, and the surrounding settlements. He tightened discipline within the walls. He also established a pattern that would repeat across northern Persia: seize or negotiate for a castle, connect it to sympathizers, and turn it into a node in a wider network. Soon, stories spread of warnings delivered without blood, A knife left beside a commander's bed, or a note pinned to a door, signals that the mountains had eyes. Whether every tale is true is uncertain, but the purpose is clear: to make siege leaders sleep lightly. The Seljuks reacted with sieges and raids. They cut roads and tried to starve the fortress, but Alamut's position and preparation made quick victory unlikely. When Seljuk commanders withdrew for other crises, as they often did in a fractured empire, Hassan's hold hardened. A small community, sheltered by geography and planning, had created a base that could outlast larger powers. We read these events through later narratives. Javani's description of Alamut's setting, Seljuk and Abbasid chronicles that note repeated campaigns, and Ismaili sources preserved after the Mongol destruction. Archaeology in the Alamut region supports the reality of extensive fortification and water management, even when written details conflict. With Alamut secured, Hassan can now think beyond survival, toward influence, and that means choosing when a dagger speaks louder than a battalion. A messenger arrives at a Persian castle gate with no banner and no army. Only a promise that resistance will be remembered. From Alamut, Hassan I Sabbah expanded carefully. The Nizaris sought strongholds that controlled passes, valleys, and supply routes. Places where a small garrison could hold out, where sympathetic villages could feed defenders, and where a sudden raid would fail. Castles such as Lamsar, also in the Alborz region, became crucial anchors. Each new fortress reduced the Seljuks' ability to isolate Alamut. Each one also forced Seljuk commanders to ask an uncomfortable question: how many troops do you commit to watch a cliff? Inside these fortresses, Hassan tightened discipline. Later hostile sources portray this as sinister brainwashing. Ismaili tradition describes religious devotion and strict obedience to the imam's cause. What can be said with confidence is that the Nizari network demanded secrecy and patience. Operatives had to blend into bazaars, caravanserais, and military camps. They needed languages, local knowledge, and the ability to wait for months. A spectacular attack meant little if it exposed the network behind it. This is where the famous term Fido I appears in later writing: one who sacrifices. The image suggests a trained agent ready to die, but we should be careful. Authors use the word differently, and many details come from opponents. Still, the pattern of operations across decades implies selection and preparation. Targets were not random. They were men whose death would change policy. A governor who ordered a massacre, a judge who authorized executions, a commander leading a siege. The cost of this strategy was constant pressure. Seljuk reprisals hit villages suspected of sympathy. Castles endured blockades. Families lived with the knowledge that a single captured courier could compromise friends. Hassan's state was not a romantic hideaway. It was a fortress society, built to survive purges that came again and again. We see the network indirectly in chronicles that list multiple Nizari strongholds, in later descriptions of fortress ruins, and in the way Seljuk correspondence and court histories treat Ismailis as a continuing security threat. Modern researchers reconstruct the geography of these castles to understand how small garrisons shaped regional politics. In Part 6, the Seljuks strike back harder, and the Nizaris answer by making fear travel faster than armies. Now, a Seljuk commander orders his tents pitched within sight of Alamut's walls, certain that hunger will do what steel cannot. After 1090, Seljuk officials treated the Nizaris as an internal enemy. Raids hit suspected villages. Arrests swept through towns like Isfahan and Ray. Public denunciations framed the movement as both heresy and rebellion. Siege warfare followed. Armies could surround a fortress, cut roads, and wait. Yet the Alborz Mountains were not kind to besiegers. Winter narrowed supply lines. Rain turned paths to sludge. A garrison that had stored grain and water could outlast an army that had to be fed every day. As pressure increased, so did propaganda. Hostile accounts described secret initiation, coded messages, and obedience beyond reason. Over time, some writers attached the label Hashashin, perhaps as a slur implying low status or moral corruption, perhaps as a misunderstanding of earlier terms. Whatever its origin, the word became a weapon. It suggested that Nizari actions were not political choices, but the spasms of drugged fanatics. That framing served Seljuk interests. It justified harsh repression and reassured frightened elites. The Nizaris answered in a different register. When a siege leader became relentless, a warning might be delivered. If warnings failed, a killing could follow, often in a place designed to broadcast vulnerability. A dagger in a crowded courtyard did more than remove a man. It told every successor, "You can be reached." The goal was deterrence as much as revenge. This approach also carried risk. Every operation required access. Every access point could be watched. Seljuk commanders learned to travel with double guards, to change routes, to restrict audiences. Yet in a world where rulers needed public rituals, Friday prayers, court receptions, inspections of troops, complete isolation was impossible. We hear of repeated Seljuk campaigns against Nizari castles in Persian and Arabic chronicles. We see the language of fear in Ibn al-Athir's entries, and later writers, including Javani, preserve the hostile vocabulary that shaped the legend. Modern historians compare these accounts with the practical realities of fortress warfare. After Nizam al-Mulk fell, guards began searching petitioners, and courtiers washed one another's hands. Suspicion became a daily ritual at the edge of power. The stage is set for a turning point in 1092, when a single assassination helps unravel Seljuk certainty and makes the Nizaris impossible to ignore. A court rides forward expecting petitions, and instead receives a death that will echo through every Seljuk campfire story. The killing of Nizam al-Mulk in October 1092 became a defining moment, part history, part contested narrative. Many medieval sources connect the attack to the Nizaris, and later tradition often names a Fidai acting for Hassan I-Sabah. Yet the Seljuk court was also a nest of rivals, and some modern historians note that factional politics could have benefited from the vizier's removal. What matters for our story is the aftermath. Seljuk leadership cracked at the seams. Within weeks, Sultan Malikshah himself died. Poison, illness, or intrigue, depending on the source. In Isfahan, courtiers hurried between residences with sealed messages. In Baghdad, diplomats measured every rumor. On the roads, soldiers demanded to know which prince they now served. The empire did not collapse overnight, but succession disputes multiplied. Competing princes sought armies and legitimacy. Governors hedged bets. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad weighed alliances carefully. In that chaos, a small, disciplined network in the mountains gained breathing room. Sieges were lifted when commanders were recalled. Purges slowed when officials feared attracting a dagger. The Nizaris exploited this shift. They did not claim cities openly, but they expanded their castle chain and refined their intelligence. In some cases, they struck high-profile targets. In others, they negotiated coexistence with local rulers who preferred a quiet frontier to endless war. The movement's survival began to look less like a miracle and more like strategy. The legend also grew. Opponents needed an explanation for why elite men could be killed despite guards and walls. It was tempting to say, they are drugged, or they are bewitched, because the alternative was worse, that a rational, organized minority could reach into the heart of power. This is how political conflict becomes moral panic. We encounter these years in Ibn al-Athir's Chronicle of the Islamic World, in Persian narratives that track Seljuk succession, and in later Mongol-era histories that reinterpret earlier events. Modern scholarship stresses the broader Seljuk fragmentation that made assassination unusually effective. Next, we follow Hassan I-Sabah as he turns disruption into a durable system, one built not on conquest, but on fortified geography and carefully chosen blows, delivered where everyone could see the consequences. At dawn, a governor opens his door to find a dagger planted in the wood. No blood, just a message. You have been measured. By the early 12th century, the Nizari Ismailis were no longer a single fortress clinging to survival. In northern Persia, their strongholds formed a chain across difficult terrain, with Alamut as a symbolic center. The Seljuks still called them dangerous heretics, but local politics often forced negotiation. A prince fighting his brother might tolerate Nizari neighbors if they promised neutrality. A governor facing banditry might accept their help securing a pass. In a fragmented world, a small actor could become an awkward necessity. Assassination, when it came, was calibrated. Targets were often men who directed persecution. commanders leading sieges, officials ordering executions, or prominent religious figures who inflamed violence. The killings were typically public, precisely because publicity multiplied deterrence. A dagger in a mosque courtyard or palace gate told a story that traveled faster than any writer. Protection is never complete. Yet the Nizaris did more than kill. They built libraries, copied texts, and maintained communities in valleys that had to farm, trade, and marry. A fortress society cannot live on legend. It needs water, grain, alliances, and discipline. Hostile chroniclers downplay this ordinary life, but even they admit the stubborn durability of the castles. From watchtowers, sentries scanned the ridges. At night, small signal fires could answer one another across valleys. A courier on a mule, moving before sunrise, could carry news from Lamsar to Alamut without ever entering a Seljuk city. This period also saw the Nizari story spread westward. Across the Syrian coastal mountains, new Nizari communities established footholds that would later matter in the age of Crusaders and Saladin. The movement was adapting to different political landscapes, Persian valleys, Iraqi courts, and Levantine frontiers, without losing its core methods. We glimpse peak influence in lists of captured or contested fortresses, in reports of negotiations and truces, and in the repeated way chroniclers mark certain deaths, as by the Ismailis. Coins and inscriptions from regional rulers remind us how often authority shifted hands. Modern historians reconstruct these patterns to show that the assassins were embedded in real politics, not fantasy. In a fractured landscape of rival courts and stone fortresses, the Nizaris turned uncertainty itself into leverage and made even powerful men feel exposed. In 1124, the man who built Alamut dies inside his fortress, and every enemy wonders whether the eagle's nest will finally fall apart. Chroniclers say the fortress kept its routine, guards on the walls, water checked, gates watched, because any sign of mourning might invite a siege. Hassan I Sabbah's death did not end the Nizari state, but it removed a single, obsessive center of control. Leadership passed to figures remembered as Lords of Alamut, and later to the imams themselves when the community's leadership became more openly asserted. For outsiders, the change looked like an opening. For the Nizaris, it was a test. Could their network survive without the founder's personal grip? Pressure returned in cycles. Seljuk factions still launched campaigns, and local rulers sometimes tried to bargain for Nizari help one year and crush them the next. Inside the movement, secrecy could breed suspicion. A fortress commander who defected or was captured and turned could expose routes, sympathizers, and safe houses. The Nizaris had to balance strict discipline with the practical need to keep communities functioning. Meanwhile, rumor grew louder than reality. As decades passed, hostile writers embroidered earlier events with new motifs, drugged initiates, staged gardens, and promises of paradise performed like theater. Some of these tales appear late and far from the Alborz. Some come from enemies who had every reason to dehumanize the Nizaris. Sources disagree, and where we cannot verify, we will say so. What is visible is the political effect. The label Hashashin became a shorthand for terror, and that shorthand traveled well beyond Syria and Persia. The wider world also changed. Crusader states took root along the eastern Mediterranean after 1099. Muslim rulers fought one another as often as they fought the Franks. Syria and northern Mesopotamia became a chessboard of castles, alliances, and betrayals. In that environment, the Nizari skills, fortress defense, intelligence, selective violence, could be exported. We hear of leadership changes and internal tensions in later Ismaili tradition, while Sunni chroniclers record continuing assassinations with moral outrage. Archaeological work on castle sites hints at long occupation and repeated repair, suggesting endurance under stress. With the founder gone and enemies adapting, the movement's survival depended less on legend than on discipline, local alliances, and the hard limits of geography. A small band rides west, not as conquerors but as guests, because in Syria, a single invitation can be worth 1,000 swords. By the mid-12th century, Nizari activity in Syria had become a strategic necessity. Persia remained the heartland, but Syria offered proximity to major trade routes, Crusader castles, and rival Muslim courts. It also offered mountains, the coastal ranges behind Latakia and Tripoli, cut by narrow valleys that could hide fortresses much like the Alborz did. The Nizaris began acquiring or occupying strongholds in this terrain, including places later associated with Masyaf, their most famous Syrian base. Sometimes they obtained a castle by bargain, sometimes by infiltration, sometimes by exploiting a feud inside the garrison, methods that left few clear records but clear results, a gate that opened and a banner that changed. The politics of Syria were brutal and flexible. Local emirs changed allegiance between Aleppo, Damascus, and Mosul. Frankish lords held fortified lines along the coast and inland passes. A ruler could be tomorrow's hostage. For a minority group, survival required constant negotiation. The Nizaris offered something many leaders wanted: intelligence, deniable force, and the ability to threaten a personal outcome without raising an army. In this setting, we meet figures whose names come through later sources with varying clarity. The most famous is Rashid al-Din Sinan, active from about the 1160s, remembered in European stories as the Old Man of the Mount. Some accounts paint him as a hypnotic tyrant. Others treat him as a political operator managing Syrian Nizari castles amid larger wars. What is safest to say is that a capable leadership emerged in Syria, coordinating with or parallel to Alamut, and adapting methods to a new frontier. The move west also changed the Nizari reputation. In the Levant, Christian and Muslim chroniclers watched the same events from different angles, and rumor traveled across language lines. A killing in Damascus might be retold in a Frankish castle, then rewritten again by a traveler decades later. We can trace Syrian Nizari footholds in medieval chronicles, in later Mamluk records of campaigns against their castles, and in the physical geography of the sites themselves. Modern historians compare Islamic sources with Frankish accounts to identify what likely happened. In Syria's coastal mountains, the same methods that worked in the Alborz would face a denser web of rivals, and far less room for mistakes. A Frankish knight tightens his grip on the reins as an unfamiliar envoy approaches, because in Syria, even a greeting can hide a bargain. The Levant in the 1140s, 1160s was a patchwork of stone. Crusader states, Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, held castles along roads and ridges. Muslim rulers competed for Aleppo, Damascus, and the routes to Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Syrian Nizaris sat in between, in the coastal mountains, close enough to threaten ports and passes yet too small to dominate them. Their survival depended on making themselves useful and making themselves feared. From Masyaf's hilltop, riders could reach the Orontes Valley, the road to Hama, and the approaches to Tripoli within days, close enough to matter, far enough to retreat. Chroniclers hint at negotiations with both sides. Some later accounts describe payments or tribute arrangements with nearby Frankish lords or military orders. The details are murky, and sources disagree on amounts and motives. What is more secure is the pattern. The Nizaris sometimes sought coexistence with a neighbor when open war would be ruinous, and they sometimes used targeted killing to punish betrayal or to force new terms. In Muslim politics, the Nizaris were one faction among many, but their method made them distinctive. A ruler might tolerate them if they struck his rival. The same ruler might denounce them publicly to satisfy religious pressure. This produced a constant double game. Envoys moved by night. Safe conducts were granted and revoked. Guards were posted not just at gates but behind the throne, because a trusted attendant could be the most dangerous figure in the room. For Crusader observers, the Nizaris were both exotic and alarming. Frankish chronicles sometimes describe assassins as a separate people with strange customs. Later European retellings amplified the mystery. But on the ground, the interactions were practical: hostages, alliances of convenience, and the management of nearby castles. We read these cross-cultural impressions in Islamic historians like Ibn al-Qalanisi and Ibn al-Athir, in Latin or Old French chronicle traditions, and in the later Mamluk records that finally list and subdue Nizari sites. Modern scholarship treats the diplomacy as real while treating the more theatrical stories with caution. Between Frankish castles and Muslim courts, the Nizaris endured by bargaining when they could, striking when they must, and never letting their neighbors feel fully safe. A man slips into a military camp at night, close enough to touch the commander's tent, then vanishes into darkness before the alarm fully spreads. In the 1170s, Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, was rising fast. He took control in Egypt, then pushed into Syria, contesting Damascus and Aleppo. For the Syrian Nizaris, his expansion was a direct threat. A strong, centralized ruler could do what fractured emirs rarely managed: concentrate troops long enough to crush mountain castles. Several medieval sources describe attempts on Saladin's life, often dated to 1175 and 1176. The details differ. Some accounts place an attack during a siege near Aleppo. Others mention assailants breaking into camp and striking at Saladin's entourage. Saladin reportedly survived, and his guards tightened security. Armor worn more often, tents ringed with trusted men, audiences restricted. Because reports vary and sometimes appear in polemical contexts, we should treat specific flourishes with care, but the repeated theme is consistent. The Nizaris were seen as a serious risk to a ruler's person. In 1176, Saladin marched toward the Nizari stronghold of Masyaf. The episode has become famous partly because it invites drama, a great conqueror facing a hidden network. Some later stories say a knife was left by Saladin's bed as a warning. Others speak of a negotiated settlement reached through intermediaries. What is safest is this: Saladin did not destroy Masyaf then. He turned away, likely because larger strategic needs, Frankish threats, Syrian rivalries, pulled him elsewhere, and because an accommodation was possible. For the Nizaris, this was both relief and warning. They had demonstrated reach, but they had also provoked a ruler who could return with greater force. Their survival continued to depend on reading the political weather and choosing the right moment to strike, or to step back. We hear of these events in Muslim chronicles that track Saladin's campaigns, writers like Imad al-Din al-Isfahani and Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad among them, in later biographies and compilations, and in the way Frankish sources watch Saladin's shifting priorities. Modern historians compare the timelines to separate likely actions from later embellishment closely, too. Whether every detail survives intact or not, the message of the Saladin era is plain. A rising empire learned to treat a mountain minority as a threat to the body as well as the border. A line of riders appears on the eastern horizon, and the rumors arrive first. The Mongols do not just conquer, they erase. By the 1250s, the political world that had allowed Nizari survival was changing. The Mongol Empire had already smashed Khwarezm, shaken Persia, and pushed into the Islamic heartlands. Hulagu, a grandson of Chinggis Khan, came west with a clear mandate: subdue resistant fortresses and end threats to Mongol control, including the Nizari strongholds that had endured for more than a century. At Alamut, leadership had passed to Imam Rukn al-Din Kursha. He faced a terrible equation. A Seljuk siege might be negotiated, delayed, or outlasted. A Mongol campaign brought engineers, massed troops, and an appetite for decisive submission. Mongol forces targeted Nizari castles one by one, forcing surrender through overwhelming pressure. Negotiations took place, but they occurred under the shadow of destruction. In the Alborz, Mongol detachments climbed the same narrow roads that had protected the Nizaris for generations, but they climbed with siegecraft. They brought mangonels and stone throwers, and they compelled local supplies on a scale earlier besiegers could not sustain. Castles such as Meymundiz were pressed hard. Some garrisons, seeing the fate of neighbors, chose surrender rather than annihilation. A few fortresses held out longer. Girdku is often cited as a stubborn hold, but the overall direction was one way. In 1256, Alamut fell. Sources describe Kursha submitting to Hulagu and the fortress being occupied. Then came the act that shaped the legend as much as any assassination: the destruction of libraries and records. Adam Malik Javani, serving the Mongols, later wrote about inspecting the site. His tone is triumphant and hostile, yet his testimony is valuable because he was close to events. Rashid al-Din, writing later under Mongol rule, also preserves details, though through an official lens. The fall was not only military, it was informational. Without Nizari archives, later writers had more room to fill gaps with rumor. The Garden of Paradise. Once Alamut was broken, The Nizari world split into survivors and fugitives. Some surrendered, some hid in valleys, some fled toward other regions. The center that had coordinated strategy for generations was gone. When Alamut's gates opened in 1256, the loss was not only stone and command, it was memory, as fire and conquest widened the space where rumor could grow. A watcher on a Syrian tower sees dust rising on the road below, and he cannot tell whether it is traitors or an army sent to end them. After the fall of Alamut in 1256, Nizari communities did not vanish, but their political posture changed. In Persia, survivors scattered into remote valleys or blended into towns where open identity could be fatal. Without the central fortress network, coordinated action became harder, and the stories told about the Nizaris began to float free of their own voice. In Syria, however, Nizari castles still stood. Strongholds in the coastal mountains, associated with Masyaf and neighboring sites, had developed their own leadership and local alliances. The Mongols arrived in the Levant too, but their advance met a new counterforce, the Mamluks of Egypt. After the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 checked Mongol momentum, the balance of power shifted again. For small mountain communities, a new question replaced the old one. Which conqueror will demand submission first? Mamluk rulers viewed independent fortresses as a threat to stability. Over the following years, they pressed Syrian Nizari sites through a mix of siege, negotiation, and forced incorporation. Campaigns are associated in Mamluk chronicles with Sultan Baybars, who was active in the 1260s and early 1270s, and with subsequent Mamluk commanders who finished the work. By around 1273, many accounts treat the Syrian Nizari political presence as effectively subdued, though communities remained. Mamluk envoys arrived with formal demands. Then engineers followed with timber and rope. When trebuchets were assembled on nearby ridges, negotiations suddenly became urgent. What did subdued look like on the ground? It meant garrisons replaced or supervised, hostages taken, and the end of independent foreign policy. It also meant, for ordinary villagers, a shift in who collected dues and who promised protection, details often lost in the grand narratives. The castles remained on their hills, but their purpose changed. We read these final steps in Mamluk-era histories, in Syrian local chronicles, and in the scattered references that note Nizari strongholds no longer acting as autonomous players. Archaeology of castle sites shows layers of rebuilding and reuse, supporting the idea of transition rather than sudden disappearance. By the early 1270s, the castles still stood on their hills, but their independence was gone, and the long experiment in fortress power had been forced into survival mode. A traveler hears a story in a roadside inn about a hidden garden, a drugged initiate, and a master who commands life and death, and he repeats it as if he saw it himself. By the late 13th century, the political assassin power had been broken. Alamut destroyed in 1256, Syrian castles brought under Mamluk control by the early 1270s. Yet the Nizaris did not end. Communities survived in Persia and beyond, and over time, they rebuilt religious life under different conditions. What ended was the fortress-based strategy that had made them a headline in medieval courts. What did not end was the image. Hostile chroniclers had strong incentives to describe the Nizaris as irrational fanatics rather than as a disciplined minority fighting for survival. Under Mongol rule, writers like Giovanni portrayed Alamut's fall as moral cleansing. Later compilations drew on earlier polemics. Then European retellings added another layer. Marco Polo's famous Old Man of the Mountain tale is vivid, but it is late and geographically slippery, and many historians treat its garden and drug details as a patchwork of rumor. Even the word itself shifted. Terms like Hashashin appear in some sources, but meaning and intent are debated. It may have functioned as an insult more than a chemical report. Over centuries, Western languages reshaped it into assassin, a common noun detached from its specific medieval context. A political conflict became a cultural archetype. So what can we say with confidence? We can say that the Nizari Ismailis built and held mountain fortresses in northern Persia from 1090, expanding a network that shaped regional politics. We can say they used targeted killing, often publicly, to deter persecution and to influence policy when they could not field armies. We can say that their enemies recorded these acts with fear and outrage, and that the destruction of Nizari records after 1256 widened the space for myth. Modern historians, among them Farhad Daftari and others who compare Arabic, Persian, and Latin sources, treat the dramatic drug stories cautiously, while taking the documented political strategy seriously. The real tale is not a fairy garden. It is a long contest of castles, couriers, oaths, and calculated violence in a world where a single person's death could redirect a war. If you'd like more series like this, careful, cinematic history without the sensationalism, leave a like or subscribe, and tell me which medieval mystery you want next. The eagle's nest fell, but the story, split between documented politics and embellished rumor, kept traveling until assassin became a word the world uses without remembering the mountains it came from.